For all institutions of long standing, there has always been a telling and retelling of the events that contribute to its perpetuity.
Fourth down, national championship. Intercepted,
For Penn State Nittany Lions football history, there have been certain games that contributed to the development and growth. In a phrase, games that have become anchors of history. The very first bowl game the Penn State football team played was here, the Rose Bowl, 1923. And this presentation of historic games and great moments in Nittany Lions football history will reach from 1923 through 1995. The man at the center of that first bowl game was Hugo Bezdek, who had coached two other teams in the Rose Bowl previously, Oregon in 1917 and the Mare Island Marines in the year of the war, 1918. The 1923 game was played at the current site of the big stadium, built originally with 57,000 seats for the sum of $272,000. A sports writer for the local newspaper, the Pasadena Star News, Harlan Hall, was the first to call the new structure the Rose Bowl, and the name stuck. The Penn State traveling squad consisted of 25 football players, departing State College by train December 19. Though Bezdek had a reputation of driving his players hard in practice, he did allow them to attend the Rose Parade in the early morning of game day. Traffic even then was challenging on New Year's Day in Pasadena. The team had trouble getting back to the hotel for their pregame meal, and even more trouble getting to the stadium for the 2:15 p.m. kickoff. Almost an hour late, opposing coach gloomy Gus Henderson of the University of Southern California accused Bezdek of being late on purpose to avoid the afternoon heat. A lot of shouting, but no blows. USC won the game 14-3. That first ever bowl game produced a check in the amount of $21,349.64 for the Emergency University Building Fund. Well, as the 20s wore on, the aggressiveness of Hugo Bezdek gained him enough detractors to take away his security, and he was replaced as football coach. Robert A. Higgins replaced him in 1930. But he came in at a time when the leadership of the school had grown tight-fisted and tight-minded. There was no financial aid for athletics, and it was tough competing in recruiting. Higgins didn't have a winning season until 1937, and then the war came. But Coach Higgins hung in. The veterans came home for the war, and finally, a quarter century after that first bowl game, the Nittany Lions, in the aftermath of the war, had an undefeated season in 1947. And the Cotton Bowl folks in Dallas said, "Come visit us. We guarantee there'll be no discrimination against the black members of your team." The Lions then went on their way to their second bowl game to play Southern Methodist, led by the great running back Doak Walker. But Cotton Bowl committee guarantees didn't have the clout to overcome local city ordinances, and the Nittany Lions wound up spending their holiday bowl trip at a naval air station, 14 miles from downtown Dallas. It was not a particularly happy time. The game was good enough, all things considered, wound up in a 13-13 tie, which was called upset because Walker and the Mustangs had been the favorites. And the alumni groups had been quieted. The growing student body embraced the winning team, and everything seemed about right. Except that Coach Bob Higgins was growing concerned about his health after 2 decades of pressure as the head football coach. Higgins thought that assistant Earl Edwards would be his successor, but the dreaded athletic board chose former player and senior member of the assistant staff, Joe Bedink. That dreaded athletic board did do something in 1949 that helped turn things for the better. It voted to authorize 100 tuition scholarships for all sports, thus finally ending the tight-fisted philosophy that had lasted since 1930. And Joe Bedenk, after one season as head coach, decided he liked teaching better than coaching, so he stepped down as the head man. Next came a huge moment in Penn State football history. Rip Engel was hired from Brown, where his teams had won 15 of 18 games, with a wing T formation run by a skinny quarterback and a fellow named Paterno. Academic rank with tenure was a major factor for Rip, that and the promise of what he might be able to do in the epicenter of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It became official April 22nd, 1950. It would last for 16 seasons, and it would be a very successful relationship. Never had a losing season. Worst record Rip Engel ever had was 5-5 his last year. His first season, the Lions beat Pitt. Now that can do a lot for your sleeping habits. Just 21-20, but that was enough. Rip was by nature a quiet sort of a fellow away from the football field, well liked by most everybody. Though he and Syracuse Ben Schwartzwalder used to get it on pretty good once in a while. But he was not a flamboyant man, not even in the locker room with his team.
We have the scissor play, as you know, and that's been our bread and butter play, and let's make it go. Remember this line, it's entirely up to you fellas to tie into your people, whoever's on that line. We don't allow any penetration. If there's any penetration anywhere along the line, it ruins the whole play.
Coach Engel was pretty particular about how he was heard and understood in public. Words used relative to his football team, Rip listened to. And he was responsible for the hero back, as Coach Joe Paterno explains.
When we were trying to play the old monster defense, you know, with the Rip would never let anybody call a monster. You know, Rip was amazing. He said, I don't like the word monster, so we had to come up with another word. So we came up with hero. Rip didn't like, in those days, what they used to have to call a blood end. Rip said, blood doesn't belong in college football. Even, you know, we would want to take our backs and move them a little bit from their normal set to get a little better, to be able to run the play a little bit better. And I'd say, we ought to cheat the backs up. Well, we shouldn't use cheat. So we used to call fudge.
At the end of the 1959 season came the first of 4 bowl games for Rip Engel's Nittany Lions, 8-2 the record, invited to play Alabama in the first Liberty Bowl game in Philadelphia. It was a miserably cold day, wind gusting better than 20 miles an hour, a few more than 36,000 on hand for the kickoff, and on top of all that misery, All-American quarterback Richie Lucas was hurt in the second quarter, opening the door for Galen Hall, they called him Butch then, to start his career at quarterback. With time running out in the first half, Alabama's Tommy White punted into a gust of wind, net 3 yards. From the Bama 18-yard line, Galen Hall knelt to hold for Sam Stellatella's field goal try. But it was a fake. Hall rolled out, set up the blocking for a screen pass to Roger Cockman. Everybody did their job, 7-0 Lions at the half. And that's the way it ended. The first of 4 straight postseason games. And then February 1966, Charles A. Engel retired from coaching with good health and satisfaction. On a snowy day, he officially gave the job over to his former quarterback at Brown, Joseph Vincent Paterno. And as history clearly tracks, it was a considerable decision in Penn State football history. It seems that Rip Engel had Joe Paterno in mind all along to succeed him as the head coach at Penn State. But Joe was busy. He was listening to offers from other places around the eastern part of the country to take jobs as an assistant coach. But he wanted to stay at Penn State. So he went to Rip and said, I want a commitment. Well, along about that time, John Pont leaves Yale to go to Indiana. Yale called, offered Joe Paterno the job. He goes back to Rip, says, what about it? Rip says, let's go see the president. They go to Dr. Eric Walker, ask the same question. He said to Paterno, if you're good enough, you'll get the job. So Joe turned down Yale. The first season was 5-5, but included a win over Pitt. then a 1-point loss to Navy to start that '67 season, followed by a trip to Miami to play the Hurricanes. And it was really the beginning then of the Paterno era, that trip to Miami. It is chronicled as the Grand Experiment.
Well, we were 5-5 my first year, and we got beaten by some good football teams. I mean, Syracuse went to a bowl game, Georgia Tech was a bowl team, UCLA was great, Michigan State was great. So we lost to some pretty good people. But the first game, my second year, we lost to Navy in a horrible game. I mean, we were horrible, and I had to make up my mind, you know, what I was going to do. And we went down to Miami, and then I started to play all those kids that were sitting on the bench when we were getting licked. I started to play Smear, and I started to play Oncuts, and Pete Johnson, and Cates, and some of the kids that were better than the guys that were playing. And that was a turning point in my coaching career.
After a 2-point loss to UCLA, the run was on towards successive undefeated seasons and the massive frustration that goes with being unrecognized for what you believe you are.
That's far to go. Third down and you gotta run. You'll get hurt if you don't.
Through the 1968 season, only a 4-point win over Army was worrisome, and the Orange Bowl folks called. Penn State would be playing Kansas, coached by Pepper Rogers, with an offense led by lefty quarterback Bobby Douglas and John Riggins at fullback. Great ball game. Kansas led late, 14-7. It was a very good Jayhawk team. The Nittany Lions got the ball near midfield with 1:28 remaining. After a timeout, Chuck Burkhart passed to Bob Campbell, who raced to the KU 3. Timeout. Coach Paterno called for 2 fullback plunges. Nothing in 2 tries. And then in came the old scissors play. In every football game where the issue is in doubt, and especially when it's late, there comes a time when you just gotta hunker down and play. All that wisdom flowing in from the sideline just gets in the way. Charlie Pittman was supposed to get the ball on that scissors play, but Chuck Burkhart had that gut feeling that the Jayhawks were just sitting waiting for Charlie, and they were gonna bury him. So he kept the ball, rolled out, and scored. Obviously, you go for 2 to win the ball game. So a pass was thrown toward the great tight end Ted Qualick, slapped away by the Jayhawks, and the KU faithful came pouring onto the field for celebration. Amidst all that carrying on is a penalty flag. Came out of the umpire's pocket, and it was a glorious piece of luck for the Lions. Kansas had 12 men on the field, half the distance and 1 more breath for Penn State. During a Kansas timeout, Coach Paterno called his play a pitch out to Campbell and a sweep right. But the crowd noise was fierce. The officials held the play, and the Lions had time to reconsider. And Coach Paterno changed his mind. He sent Bob Campbell on a sweep all right, but to the left. And he scored. Penn State 15, Kansas 14. Later, one of the Kansas coaches is said to have confirmed the 12th man, not just for the 2-point try, mind you, but for the entire defensive series. Pictures confirm it. Well, Coach Paterno questioned his own staff who were upstairs watching all this going on. What were you guys doing when Kansas was in their 6-6 defense? George Welch, who was an assistant then at Penn State, answered, cheering. Well, work started immediately for the 1969 season. Recruiting, coaching, selling the idea to the people who wore the hard hats, you can win them all again. October 18, 1969, the Nittany Lions at Syracuse. Never a pleasant trip, but it produced another batch of mortar for the foundation of the Paterno era. Well, Ben Schwartzwalder's troops led 14-0 after 3 quarters. This was the season that Lydell Mitchell and Franco Harris had joined Charlie Pittman in the Penn State backfield. Finally, a bit of luck as the Orange, trying for a 3rd touchdown, was stopped. Lydell Mitchell capped the state drive with a touchdown. A second 2-point try came after a holding call on Syracuse, and Franco Harris made it 14-8. Then Jack Ham got a hand on a Syracuse punt. The Lions got the ball at the Orange 36, and Franco thundered in on the first play. Mike Wrights kicked the point, 15-14, Nittany Lions, and it finished that way. And oh, the caterwauling that followed, including a formal official protest from Syracuse that was denied by the ECAC commissioner. Well, the rest of the season fell into place just right for the Lions. They went back to the Orange Bowl. They met and beat a very good Missouri team, Dan Devine was the coach, and they had some money in the bank. But for a second successive season, winning all your games, not good enough to be voted anybody's national champion. Oh my goodness, it made the old Nittany Lion pretty cranky.
Sure, a bunch of sports writers and the president felt we weren't the #1 team in the country, but in our minds we were. And I really think we would have beaten anybody, lined up against anybody and beaten them, because we had such confidence. We had good players. We had very good players. We didn't beat ourselves. And, in my mind, we were the best team.
Then came 1973. Running back John Cappelletti was the big hammer, and he won the Heisman Trophy. Closest win was a 6-point decision over NC State. Coach Paterno had turned aside a big-money professional offer from the New England Patriots, had made a commencement speech, bought a new suit, and life was pretty good. But the 1973 season, with all of the success and all the hope of finally being voted a national champion, didn't happen again. Alabama and Notre Dame played for that in the Sugar Bowl. The Lions beat LSU in the '74 Orange Bowl 16-9 and finished 5th in the major polls. And Coach Paterno went out and bought his Nittany Lions their own national championship rings. And so we marched to an epic game in the Sugar Bowl following the 1978 season against Alabama. I called that Sugar Bowl game, and as the years have passed, that game continues to rank as one of the best college football games I've ever seen, much less broadcast. There was quality all over it, on both sides of the field. The Crimson Tide had started the season #1 in the Associated Press poll, lost to Southern California in the 3rd game. Penn State won them all going into the Sugar Bowl game and was ranked #1 in the nation. Alabama, 2. And the game was as good as the preamble, and the preamble wasn't bad. It didn't figure that defense could dominate, but it did. 4th quarter, tied up 14-7, 7:57 to play in the ball game. Lions' Joe Lally covers a bad Bama pitch out, and opportunity embraced the Lions. One of the biggest plays of the season and the game, certainly. Busina passes to Scott Bitsky, but cornerback Don McNeil knocks him out of bounds a yard short of the goal line. It was 3rd and 1. Matt Suey tried to go over the top, stopped. Decision-making raged on the sideline. Finally, Mike Gooman would try to climb the mountain, but linebacker Barry Krause met him at the peak, and the ball went over. The Tide held on, won 14-7, and they were voted, at least in one poll, national champions, and the Nittany Lions' chance for an unquestioned national title was gone again. After a game and a season like '78, ending with a loss, it takes some time for regeneration. That includes coaches perhaps more than players, and sometimes the entire campus population. But then came 1982, and Lady Fate peeked out from nowhere. There was a win over a very, very good Nebraska team, and the hopes soared. Then there was a trip to Alabama, and a loss, and the hopes plummeted. Then there was some serious clubhouse lawyering. 4 straight wins followed. And then came a stop at Notre Dame.
And we just decided that we couldn't lose any more games, that we were still in the thick of things, that we didn't feel that any team in the country was going to go undefeated and win the national championship like Clemson did the year before, and that we were still very much in the pictures.
It was November 12. Arctic air with snow flurries greeted the Lions as they stepped off the plane in South Bend. Coach Joe Paterno picks up the story.
I'll never forget, we played Notre Dame the first time we went out to Notre Dame. There was a television guy that was cold as a Dickens, and he said, well, how's it feel to take a team out to South Bend for the first time, play an Irish team? I said, it's a great tradition. I said, I Imagine it's like most every field. You know, I'd been to play for the national championship and a couple other things, so I wasn't really overwhelmed. And then another television guy got me and asked me the same thing. And by that time, I was getting a little annoyed. You know, Notre Dame is a great place, great tradition, but you know, we felt we had one too. So I'll never forget. I was so fired up that night, Friday night. I said to the kids, "Listen, you put those plain uniforms on, and you put those black shoes on, and you go out there tomorrow with those plain helmets." And I said, "Unless Rockney jumps out of the ground and tackles you," I said, "our tradition's every bit as good as theirs. All right, and let's see what happens."
He didn't, and the Lions got after the Irish with authority, winning 24-14. Quarterback Todd Blackledge and running back Kurt Warner both had big seasons. The Lions throwing the ball so well, the media even started calling the offense Air Paterno. And it was this win over Notre Dame that resulted in Penn State being voted into second place in the polls after the Pitt win.
You know, we've come a long ways, and I play with a bunch of great guys. I play with a bunch of guys that have had to just scrap and fight and claw for everything that we've received this year.
Another trip to the Sugar Bowl had been offered and accepted to meet the Georgia Bulldogs, Dogs making their second straight trip to the Superdome. Herschel Walker was a junior. He'd won the Heisman and was on his way to the pros. Georgia, ranked number 1. The Nittany Lions scored first in the ball game. Kurt Warner from 2 yards, 7-0. Gancitano hits a 38-yard field goal, and Warner ran in for another touchdown from 9 yards. It was 17-3 after Kevin Butler had hit a Georgia field goal. Gancitano's third three-pointer from 45 yards made it 20-7, and the Lions looked like they might be breezing. Well, not quite. Herschel Walker got one for the Dogs. And in the first possession of the third quarter, the Bulldogs hammered down the field. Walker scored again to make it 20-17. The game was on. Early in the final quarter, Penn State ball at the Georgia 47. A basic play. You fake to Warner. Defense got to respect him, you know that. There are 4 receivers, flying down the field. Up to Blackledge. Pick the right one, the open one. And he did. Greg Garrity tumbled into the end zone. Penn State voted national champions final.
3, 2, 1, Penn State national champions! Penn State has won the ball game, 27-23. What a tribute to this football team. What a tribute to his coach.
The return home was memorable.
Ride back from Harrisburg to State College the night we came home with this 90-mile parade, literally, with the highways lined with kids and older women and people in fire engines in every little town welcoming us and saying number one, with thousands and thousands of people just beside themselves with joy and excitement and happiness and pride. I keep coming back to the word pride in Penn State and Penn State football and in the state of Pennsylvania.
We move ahead to 1986. New people, new supply of adrenaline, and a chance at more whoopee. But there was old Notre Dame, smack dab in the middle of the road. Oh, it was a game to rattle the china, wearing down to the final minutes. Penn State leading 24-19. Notre Dame with the ball. First and goal on the Lions' 6-yard line. 1:18 to play.
And I think about urgency that was taking place in that huddle when Notre Dame was driving, which would have put them ahead had they scored, and the bonding that became even greater that night between that defensive unit. I think there was a belief that someone in that huddle was going to make a big play, and in that one drive, I think there was 2 or 3 huge plays that were made. And I think that's one game that sticks out in my mind, because there were a lot of people really laying it all on the line, and they didn't leave anything, they left it all on the field.
And here are the final 4 plays, as I call them, on ABC Sports.
Outside, option Brown, caught, brought down, loss on the play to the 9. Ray Isom, number 22. Fairline is sacked back at the 20-yard
pit, the Desert Rumble at the Fiesta Bowl was set. Number 1, Miami, and number 2, Penn State. As practice ground on, there were enough pleasant moments to keep some reality about the whole thing, like the thousands of faithful who came to the blue and white rally in the desert.
It's really fantastic. I've never been to a rally like this with as much as enthusiasm or as many people. And God bless you for coming out and help cheer on the greatest bunch of kids I have ever been associated with.
State had its first real big chance to go for the lead, and D.J. Dozier cashed it in for a 14-10 lead in the final quarter. But Miami wasn't ranked number 1 without reason. They'd been there most of the season. And sure enough, as the seconds grew to a precious few, the Hurricanes were knocking on the Lions' door. The last big play, Testaverde dropped back, his eyes locked on wide receiver Brett Perriman. He threw the ball, and dropping linebacker Pete Giftopoulos was in the right place at the right time. He cradled the ball, dropping to his knees, and the Nittany Lions had their second national championship, according to the posters. And so the 80s ended with 89 wins, 2 national championships, 2 ultimate highs, and 1 memorable low. That was when the Nittany Lions were 5-6 in 1988, the only losing season in Joe Paterno's 29 years as head coach. The 1994 season was the most offensive season in the history of Penn State football. There were 10 school records, led the nation in scoring, averaging just under 48 points a game, and better than 520 yards per game in total offense, both those numbers leading the national stats. And there was the drive to pull out a win at Illinois when victory seemed nearly impossible. Kerry Collins, in the dark of late afternoon, hit 7 straight passes. Fullback Brian Milne crashed in from 2 yards for a 35-31 lead. And safety Kim Herring's game-ending interception made it official. With wins over Northwestern and Michigan State, the Nittany Lions had their ticket to the Rose Bowl, a mere 72 years since they had been to Pasadena. So many times the Rose Bowl game has involved Michigan and Ohio State from the Big Ten, UCLA and USC from the Pac-10. It was particularly refreshing to have Penn State matched against Oregon, the Ducks having made their last Rose Bowl appearance in 1958. It was a very festive time and turned out to be a tough ticket and a good ball game. In the shadow of all this fun, there lurked the fact the Nebraska Cornhuskers were ranked number 1 in the national polls. And in all the history of the polls, no team had ever lost that position when they had won their bowl game. Well, Nebraska beat Miami the night before the 1995 Rose Bowl game. Some people suggested advantage Oregon, since the Nittany Lions might well realize their chances of being number 1 were virtually nil. On the very first scrimmage play for the Penn State offense, Kajana Carter took the shock of contact, shook off a tackler, and streaked 80 yards for the game's first touchdown. 7-0 Lions. But after that, Oregon gave the Nittany Lions all they wanted. Long pass, Kerry Collins to reserve wide receiver Joe Juravicius set up the go-ahead touchdown to make it 14-7 at halftime, and the Lions never trailed. The defense, which had had its struggles during the season, held up well in the second half. Number 29, Chuck Penzenik, making his first start at free safety, had 2 interceptions to become Walter Mitty of the day, and it was a 38-20 win for the Nittany Lions. But no vote for number 1. Incredibly, only 1 of the 5 unbeaten, untied teams at Penn State have been voted number 1. That was 1986.
Sounds like to me, Joe, that you believe in your heart that this is the best team in the country. I think I'll have to agree with them.
There have been so many great moments during the rich history of Nittany Lion football, so many benchmark games. 1982, one of the great games ever played in Beaver Stadium. The Lions down 24-21 to Nebraska. Late in the game, here comes the late march, climaxing in a Todd Blackledge to Kirk Bowman touchdown pass. And the Lions beat the previously undefeated Cornhuskers 27-24 along the way to that first national championship. January 1, 1972, the wishbone offense, the offense of the 70s, and nobody could do it better than Texas, but a tenacious Penn State defense, led by Bruce Bannon, shuts down Darrell Royal's Longhorns in the Cotton Bowl to win 30-6. The first time Texas is held without a touchdown in 80 games. 1981 at Pitt, the Panthers, #1 of the nation, undefeated behind quarterback Dan Marino. But it's Todd Blackledge who beat the drums that day, hooking up with favorite target Kenny Jackson for 2 touchdowns, and the Lions scored 48 unanswered points to whip the Panthers 48-14. On the way to that 86 title, the Nittany Lions were giant killers on the road again, ending the nation's longest winning streak and handing then #2 Alabama its worst home loss in 31 years. It was a win that put the Lions into the championship chase. In 1990, it was unbeaten and top-ranked Notre Dame that tasted the Nittany Lions' road magic. Another comeback, this Darren Perry interception, setting up Craig Fayak's last-second field goal to win in South Bend. Many say that the Penn State football program came of age under Rip Engel, when the underdog Lions, led by the passing of quarterback Gary Whiteman, upset #2 Ohio State before 84,000 fans in Columbus, a game voted the upset of the year in college football in 1964. Well, in 1978, Joe Paterno took his team into the same stadium, the old Horseshoe, and knocked off then #1 and undefeated Ohio State. Pete Harris picks off this arch-Leister pass and races for 33 yards. It was one of 8 turnovers forced by the Nittany Lion defense that day on the way to a 19-0 win over the Buckeyes. Great teams, great moments, great people, and perhaps more than a fair share of poll disappointment. But this is the Penn State legacy. If it is so that denial fuels the next effort, then the years to come should provide the Penn State faithful with more opportunities to cheer, more games to watch, that may well anchor more Nittany Lions football history.